Welcome to a new episode of Outside the Panels with your host, Johnny the Machine Hughes.
Welcome everyone to an episode of Outside the Panels, and I got a guest for you. Here are some of the books that this gentleman has worked on: Hack Slash, Grayson, Nightwing, Batman Eternal, Batman and Robin Eternal, Bloodshot, Money Shot, Gwenverse in a month, and of course the new book Chronphage, which we're going to be talking a lot about, is the multi-talented Tim Seeley.
Hey,
Tim,
good.
how are you doing? You all right?
It's much sunnier here, clearly, than there.
Well, this is half past. What time is it? 8:30 in northeast UK. So
This is 2:30 in the afternoon in Chicago. So
okay, cool, excellent, good shout. What's Chicago? Is that east? That's not Eastern time, is it? That'll be
Central. Yeah.
Central. I'm all right. I'm getting good with my time zones. Me and Doctor Who and time were like that.
Well, that's good because that's what this book is about. So
Exactly right. Exactly right. Okay, so we're talking about your new book, Chronphage from Humanoids, which comes out on February 16th. So what was the kind of inspiration for this book? What kind of set the wheels in motion? Because it's a little bit different to some of the other stuff you've done, but then in other places not so much.
yeah, I guess it depends. Well, I mean, I just kind of had this the notion at some point of like I think it was inspired kind of by just I read a lot of science articles for Money Shot. I was doing that, and then the kind of relativity of time and all this sort of thing. And my wife got pregnant about 3 years ago now, because it takes 9 months to make one. But so, and there was
does it take 9 months to make one? Really? Are you just bragging there?
Maybe it's just me. I don't know. But you know, it was a whoops, right? We were we were at a convention and we were kind of drunk, and clearly we weren't thinking. And so, you know, this consideration in our head at the time was like, what do you do here? And obviously there's a lot of choices you can make. And so just, you know, I knew my life was going to change. And then I was kind of kicking around that concept, and pandemic happened, and I was suddenly, you know, in the house with a 3-month-old for 2 years. And so a lot of it is just sort of like really having time sort of dropped in my head. You know, in aspects of like, you know, what would you change? Could you change it? And if you'd done something differently, who would be here and who wouldn't? And then also just how I'm so aware of, you know, this time I lost. You know, I mean, and I'm still losing, I guess, right? I mean, it's just and so, you know, all those things kind of got fused together to this, you know, story about regret and loss and you know, love, and also just how aware we are as people now about time and how short it is and how long it can feel, and all those.
Yeah, it's interesting because in the blurb for the book, obviously, you know, sex is an element of this. And I kind of, when I was writing my notes, I thought, you know, Money Shot was the book where sex sells, right?
Yeah.
And this is a book where sex, time flies when you're having fun.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
So it's kind of the juxtaposition between the two kind of made me laugh. But that's not that's not the key point. I mean, don't get me wrong.
There's part of it. Yeah.
The sex is in it, of course it is. But that's like saying, you know, Knight Rider is just about the car. Yeah, the car's the modus operandi,
right?
But the rest of it's everything else, right? The sex is the vehicle, but everything else happens because of it, right?
Yeah. What is Knight Rider about? It's not about the car.
It's about one man on a crusade to champion the innocents. Do you not remember the intro?
Oh, I do. I didn't know if there was a greater theme I was missing out on.
One man can make a difference.
True. Cool. One man who's got a really cool black car.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah,
maybe that was the greatest metaphor I've ever used in my life.
But I think, you know, like the one of the things that I talked about to Humanoids when they asked me if I was interested in working with them, and I was like, yeah, Humanoids has this great history for me for science fiction, and I really liked the idea of working with Rob Levin, who was the editor there. But he had said, I was kicking around this idea, and he said, I'd really like to do a horror story romance. I was like, oh, I have one. But I really felt like if you're doing a story about time, I feel like intimacy is such a part of that, especially when I was stuck in the house and have been for 2 years. That lack of human contact and like how much of your time, is with people, and kind of this thing that kept striking me with horror while I was sitting in this, in this house, like, well, if I can't see my parents, the first 3 months of the pandemic, like if I can't see my family, like how much time will I spend with my mom and dad? And is that just something I can quantify into just days or hours, right? Like, as we get older, like maybe you only got, and you don't know, but you may only have 5 hours left or 10 hours or 3 days, or you don't know. That just seemed really terrifying. That was truly scary to me.
It's so the main character is Chloe.
Yeah.
Chloe has an intimate encounter with Heath. Great names, by the way. And from that encounter, something manifests itself, right?
Yeah. He essentially, and this is something I wanted to kind of play in the book too, is that if we're talking sort of about intimacy and how many people you can kind of pass in your life and not have them directly affect you. We use sex essentially is that's the way that their lives entwine. The moment that they have sex, some level of their lives are now stuck together. And I just, obviously it's a metaphor for, pregnancy and all these other things, but also just to the degree of, this is a play to some degree on vampire stories, which obviously are a favorite for me, but because there's this sort of exchange of something. And I guess I was kind of working on this metaphor, in the vampire story, it's blood, but in this story, it's kind of the exchange of being in the same place at the same time, right? Like you literally cannot get closer to someone at that moment. And I felt like that, was a kind of a good metaphor for how people, your relationships kind of become entwined, and, and so that was the symbol, I guess, and then allowed us to have lots of sex scenes in this story.
Indeed. So it's kind of like the ancillary characters also have an impact, not just on Chloe, because they're the people she potentially has other connections with, but down the line, Heath has his own ancillary characters that he's kind of potentially dredged up from the past and so on. It is an absolute metaphorical observation of relationships, isn't it? Because it's not just you and a partner, it's you, a partner, their friends, your friends, their family, and the guy who knows a guy who knows a guy who knows the guy. And any one of them can have such an impact on someone's life, and I think that themes resonates throughout the whole book, especially with the friend that she tries to call when she's stuck in the rain. Lena, and it's kind of, for me, I know there's other aspects in the book or the characters, but for me, I think Lena's one of the anchors.
Yeah, for sure, because her absence in Chloe's life is kind of what sets this up. And one of the things that I was thinking about is like how hard it is to, because I've had to do time travel stories before. It's a staple of like superhero science fiction comics, and one of the hard things about writing them is like people always do this story where someone goes back in time to change something, but like that there's an inherent sort of, well, then you wouldn't be there sending this back, or you wouldn't be observing it. It's in the past, right? Like,
oh, don't get me started.
Right.
I mean, spoiler alert for those that haven't seen Spider-Man No Way Home or whatever the last Spider-Man movie.
I haven't seen it, so.
Have you? Oh, right. Spoiler alert over there. I'm not going to say anything.
Okay. Well, I'm sure that. I mean, there has to be part of that. I'm not going to even guess because I feel like I'd get too close. But this story, what was kind of hard to do about it is Chloe doesn't know who this woman is. She can see sort of the echoes of her in her life, and she sees it as a ghost, right? It sort of starts out as a ghost story, and I wanted to do that because I wanted you to, when you read this book, you're not sure what kind of story it is. At first, there's a haunting. It appears to be a haunting. And then, you have these other sort of monster stories that she goes through. But, I thought that would be, that's something I hadn't seen in a time travel story before, is like, it's already changed. Your life is already different, right?
Yeah,
like, and so,
definitely.
you know, we've kind of set up, I had to like read a lot of physics books to, and of course we faked it a little bit, but like, you know, the idea of like dimensions above the one that we see, and so, you know, when she's in it, and then we use it as a metaphor for comics itself, right? Because we get into some stuff about how comics are time and space put together, which is what this book is about, is time and space put together. So yeah, it's a lot. There's a lot more to it than you know, not to criticize my own work, but some of my stuff is just fun and gory, and this one has a lot more to it, you know.
And I suppose this is kind of leads into my next question a little bit, is that you have such a body of work, whether it be superhero stuff like Grayson and Nightwing and the Bats, of course. You've also got stuff like Hack Slash, which is a fun book. You know, you've got Bloodshot. That was an interesting take on that. So you kind of, how do you juggle being somewhat mainstream as well as having quite a large foot in the indie pool as well?
I mean, I don't know if I do. I know that yeah, I mean, I can do the work, and I don't think mainstream superhero fans like me that much most of the time. Some of them do, but
before you go there, right? Let me give you were my dark horse pick to replace Tom King on Batman. Yeah,
not Batman, but that job would be so hard, and you know, and largely just because of what I'm talking about. But you know, the expectations of fandoms for those kind of characters are just immense, and I know because I worked on Nightwing and I worked on Batman and stuff. But and I feel like, you know, I can do anything that I have a feeling for. If I have some kind of, you know, I can do the story, which is, you know, I had a lot of love for Robin. You know, as a kid, I love that character. I love the idea, and for me, I have to have an emotional in. I have to have some in. It can't be just, you know, I like trashy, sleazy, violent, sexy, stupid shit. That's what I like. But I don't like it if it doesn't mean anything. If it doesn't feel anything. I don't feel it. So for me, I have to like have an in. It has to be fun to do, but I have to have an in. Like, what's the heart of this? And that's why, you know, when people read Hack Slash when it first came out, I remember a big reaction to it was like, oh, you'd never think a slasher movie would have this much heart. But like, I can't watch those things if I don't have some kind of connection. And I think a lot of people are that way too. You have to have some kind of emotional connection to it. So, you know, for me, when someone says, hey, would you be interested in doing this? I always think on it. And if I can connect to it somehow, then I'll put that out. And, you know, and certainly there have been things that I didn't, and you never saw it because I couldn't come up with a pitch for it. I couldn't connect to it. You know, like I couldn't come up with a story that I cared about. You know, but something like Bloodshot for me was, you know, I guess the overall connection was, oh, it's 90s comic book Frankenstein, right? Okay, sure, I can do this. But the emotional connection for me was, you know, essentially like he can't die, so the stakes aren't that, but he can be used to hurt people. And so that's a horror for me, right? Like the idea that you could do something and hurt someone, that really bothers me, right? Like that's one of the biggest sources of any sort of guilt I've ever had in my life, is if like, you know, I felt like something I did hurt somebody. So that was my emotional connection. Can I make this story about a guy, you know, he's not afraid of death, but maybe it's worse because he's afraid he'll cause that for other people. Like I get that. I can relate to it. So that's kind of all. I mean, that's just the way I approach everything. And maybe it's, I don't know, maybe it's unnecessary. But certainly I've had stuff where I was like, I don't have a good emotional connection to this. So, you know, I can't.
Well, fair enough. I mean, if you don't enjoy writing it, how do you expect people to enjoy reading it, right?
Yeah. And, you know, I kind of feel like the unsort of seen hero of any story, and especially now more, is that there's some moment that people connect to it on that very visceral level, right? Like it appeals to the, you know, like I was watching the Peacemaker show, which, you know, is really fun, but it's about, you know, this guy trying to be better, but he just kind of can't. He can't get out of right? Like that's interesting, right? You know, and he's just kind of you know, he's been broken for so long that he can't, you know, he can't
get out of his own way.
Yeah, exactly. Like, yes, it's about an idiot with a helmet and an eagle. Yeah, sure, but you know, I always have to have that. I think that's
So this is the point I was making. That's the ex machina. That's the bit that gets him from point to point. But it's the stuff that happens other than that. Excellent, spot on. Okay, so you're a bit of a what's his name? I'm going to say Jim Jensen from the Dolphins years ago. I'm a Dolphins fan. What can I say? Go Miami, fins up. He did everything.
yeah,
Threw the ball, caught the ball, ran the ball, blew the football up, dated a cheerleader, did it all.
yeah.
You have this reputation in comic book world of you've been an editor, you're a writer, you're an artist, you're an inker. Which do you prefer?
I mean, if I had my dithers, I'd just do it all. I would write it and I would draw it and I would do everything.
Staple it in the middle.
Yeah, I would go to the printing press and all that. I mean, because to me, and I was thinking about this recently, because for me, when I was a kid, I just knew you made comics. I didn't know there were separate jobs. And that, and I didn't know that it was separate jobs probably until I was a teenager. Really, I didn't really understand that. So, now the industry isn't really built that way. But I guess the truth is I don't prefer any of them. If I do drawing for too long, I want to write something. If I write for too long, I want to draw. I really like working with other people, so editing scratches that thing. So if I did do something by myself, I would miss working with people. Like, I'm just unhappy. Like, I have to do this all because I don't get what I want out of just one thing, So that's a big part of it. I teach at a college now because I love working with people and watching them get better. It's like a high for me, and I've always enjoyed that. And there's a lot of people who work in comics now that, like, I was someone early who was like, "Hey, I want to hire you. You're awesome," because I've always had that interest. So I guess it just means that I have to run around. I'll never just have one thing or just be a writer or two.
Cool. Cool. When we talk about art, let's give a shout out to your book's artist. I'm going to get this wrong because it's my mutant ability is to say people's names wrong. This is Ilyas Karazias.
That sounds right to me.
Yes. Yeah.
All right. Heard him say he's in Greece, so he and I haven't. We don't talk too much.
All right. Okay. Cool. This is the curse benefit of modern day comic books, isn't it? The fact that everybody is now so international.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Curse and benefit, yeah, for sure. Yeah.
And of course the pandemic and travel restrictions and all that sort of stuff, But hey, thank God for the internet. So
yeah.
What was it? The art's really striking. I really liked the bits. It's hard to put like a quantifiable style on it for me because some of it's really quite realistic, especially when Chloe's in her apartment. Then some of it's really cartoony and kind of exaggerated. Of course, it tries to be a little bit sexy when the scenes come on and the camera angles change and whatever. How was it keeping track of the different styles in play for this then? Especially, with your editor head on or with your artistic head on?
I mean, I picked Ilyas because I'd worked with him on a Crow book that we'd done. Ooh. And I mean, the version you described, that's the artist I want. I want an artist who chooses what's necessary for the scene, So if it's a scene that demands exaggeration, I want it there. And if it's a scene that it won't, and obviously the problem I think is a lot of illustrators are not cartoonists, and a lot of cartoonists are not illustrators, and that they're sort of unable to, they can do this sort of exaggerated sort of thing, but they can't do something that tells a story. Or if they're a really great exaggerated cartoonist, simplified person, they can't really tell a story. And Ilyas says he can do all that, and he colored this as well. And that was something we pushed for because he's an amazing colorist of his own work. He knows, the page that you just showed, like the lighting and stuff, that using sort of symbolic color, which is something I'm hugely a proponent of. He's amazing. So I knew that, when we were talking about doing this book, I really pushed for him because I knew he would be able to do the human stuff. And I think he has struggled sort of, and I think he even talked about this on Twitter the other day, to get superhero publishers to say this guy's work will work in a superhero book, because there's this kind of sad sort of aspect that people who read superhero books think they should be really realistic, so it doesn't embarrass them, I guess. I don't know.
Well, have you read the Batgirls book recently?
Yeah, there is getting more towards it. I agree, and part of that is the audience is changing, right? The kids who grew up on manga. They don't, it's all cartoony to them. So I think that's a big part of it. But there's there's still this sort of hang on that it has to be, as many lines as possible and dark and gritty and, photorealistic, like all things I hate. And Hughes doesn't do that. He does what it needs to be done. It's like, it's just what you said. Like, I don't have to keep track of it because I know he'll do it. All I have to do is sort of set the scene, and he'll choose the right acting, the right, right colors, if it's symbolic or if it's realistic, if it's, exaggerated because it's supposed to be funny, if it's exaggerated because it's supposed to be scary. I know he'll do it. I don't have to, do it. It's perfect. So
it's interesting that you talk about the different art styles. I think very much. I mean, I'm an old timer. I've been reading comics since the 70s, so I grew up on people like Adams and Aparo. Those are my guys, right?
Oh, absolutely.
And then, of course, you move into the 80s, and it's still Aparo and John Byrne. Then it's Jim Lee. Then it's Mark Silvestri. Then it's kind of and McFarlane, and then Image.
Yeah.
So I think the overhang of all that is the fact that we have sort of stagnated into that, especially with superhero comics, that dynamic, big chest, strong character artwork. And as recent books have shown you, it doesn't have to be like that. I mean, I picked the Batgirls book particularly because the book, the art is just so different to what DC is pushing out. I'm not saying it's bad different, I'm saying it's different. It's same with the Supergirl Woman of Tomorrow book by, I think it's L.V. Bilquist.
Yeah.
What a gorgeous book that is.
Yeah.
It drops this week, chapter 8. If Crypto gets it, I'm going to be.
We revolt.
Hey, if Crypto gets it, I want you to pass me to Tom King so I can have a word.
Yeah.
Because it's like I started reading this book, and when the dog issue 1, I was like, oh my god, no. And every month, this book when it drops on my pile to read, it is the first book I read. I mean, Supergirl's always been a bit of a guilty pleasure book for me, but Supergirl Woman of Tomorrow is one of the first books I read.
Just because the dog.
Because I want to know what happens to the dog. And I mean, have you seen how many words are in the damn thing? It's like reading a novel.
Yeah, it's really dense, which is unusual for Tom because he tends to be pretty sparse.
Well, yes and no on that, because I think sometimes if you compare it to Batman Catwoman, for example, it might be, the dialogue might be less in Batman Catwoman, but it's over a longer period because it's like 12 issues, right? So
totally.
I don't know if there's an element of elongation in there, but hey, go.
Well, I think you said something in there that you mentioned was stagnation, and all those characters, all those artists you mentioned, they're all a reaction to someone else, right? So
correct.
You hired Neil Adams to make a realistic Batman because you were reacting against the pervasive effect of Batman 66, right? It was
right.
So they're like, hey, we got to bring Batman back to this realistic thing, and so you hire Adams, and he's really realistic, etc. But then you get into the 90s, and you mentioned McFarlane. McFarlane is cartoony. There's nothing realistic about his work, and it's a reaction against. It's always, well, not always. It used to be this really, it was always reactions. There's a scale. There's realistic on one side. There's some, cartoony, less realistic, and then we would swing back and forth. John more cartoony. All this sort of thing. But I do feel like there's a stagnation. Then probably since like, maybe Ultimates kind of made it. Brian Hitch, the original sort of guy who developed this style, but people kind of stuck to that. It has to be realistic. And they didn't get what Hitch was doing, and they didn't understand it. And so, and so we kind of stayed there for a long time. You have a lot less, and maybe you're right. Maybe it's now just beginning that we're accepting more stuff like Batgirls, which I thought was beautiful. And
I think it's great. I'm a die-in-the-wool Steph Brown fan, so you know what? Yeah. I like the old Batgirl books. So what am I going to say? I'm guilty as charged. Do you think that the influx in the art style and some of the kind of writing techniques that are going on in the minute in mainstream comics is because mainstream publishers, yes, I'm talking about you, Marvel and DC, are they now more open to having indie creators? I mean, people like Ram V, who made his name on Vault Comics. There's yourself. There's Stephanie Phillips. You know, these are all writers who started off indie and then became more. I don't know. Do I say big two? I'll say big two. Became more big two of that.
Yeah, it's always to some degree been a recruiting ground. I think going back to, I mean, probably a long time in the history, you would do a book for an indie publisher and then you get noticed, and that's true of, even Alan Moore, right? He started in 2000 AD and got recruited essentially, and Grant Morrison, same thing. I think that's part of the deal. I think now part of it is there's such a different quality to the independent publishers, and I don't mean quality like how good it is, but the difference in, for a long time you kind of had Dark Horse and Image and these things where there's a certain kind of fandom you were going for. It's usually the sort of more mature reader, like people were kind of moving out of superheroes, or it was the intent you would go read something more adult, and now you see people getting pulled from different stuff, like cartoonier stuff, kids stuff. The editors at DC and Marvel right now are all so good. They're really, they know what they like. So you're getting editors with very distinct taste, and that's definitely true of DC. Where like you've got, and a lot of these are young. They're young people. They're not, maybe they're just out of college a few years, and so they're bringing in stuff that they grew up on, which is different than the stuff you and I grew up on. And I think that's only a good thing. And my hope for Super Comics was always like truly books for every reader. And I feel like, that means I want books for teenage girls and I want books for 60-year-old dudes too. We should have a whole range of books because there's, we should be a medium that appeals to as many people as possible, right? Like,
great, absolutely.
Not be ashamed of any of it. But
totally.
the problem is, you take some books and make them for someone else, and then the remaining fans, they get angry, and then it's just stupid. So
Well,
that's the whole problem, So
this is great point, because I always I do a show called Flipside Focus about indie books, and somewhere in there's always a Zenoscope joke in there. Now, I'm not saying Zenoscope comics are bad; they're just not for me, right?
Which should be fine. Yeah,
exactly. And I'm totally fine with it. I was totally fine when Babs Tarr was on Batgirl and changed the whole dynamic. It wasn't a Batgirl for me, so I stopped reading it. And then when it became Batgirl for me again, start picking it back up. I'm very much of a, maybe it's because I'm nowhere near 60, by the way. Thanks for that. Maybe it's because I live in this world that says
70s. That's where we are, right?
I'm not there either. So I'm of the world that if I don't like it, I don't buy it.
Yeah. I
don't go onto Twitter to whinge about not liking it. I just don't buy it. Simple as. So.
Yeah. And I wish that was more the attitude. There's, it's weird, but it's not just old dudes that do it. I mean, the kids do it too. It's just there's this sort of weird, I don't know, like it's personal. It's just like, well, these things have to go on for a long time, and they should be different. The ideal thing would be you move on from superheroes and try something out. Like you're like, oh, I really liked Howard Chaykin on Star Wars. I'll go buy American Flag. Like I wish that's how.
I really did like Howard Chaykin on Star Wars, that first issue, before I got all photorealism. Fantastic. One of my favorite issues of Star Wars.
But I mean, the problem was then people still wanted Howard to do superhero stuff, and he just didn't want to. And it's like, and letting people do something different that follows what their passions are, I think is the ideal. It's my big dream, and I can go rant on that forever, I guess. But.
Indeed. All right. So whilst we calm down from the rant, let's have one of our adverts for one of our other shows on the UCPN. Where shall we go? Well, you brought up Age, so I suppose we better go and play this one. Here is the Old Timers.
Do you want to find out what makes the professor do his happy dance? Check out the Old Timers Comic Book Show, only on the UCPN.
There you go. The Old Timers Comic Book Show, where the hosts aren't old, but the comics most certainly are. Have to be 25 years old or more to get on that show. So go and check out that. There you go. Excellent. Right. So back to Chronphage, because we digressed a little bit on this one. I read in the blurb, there's a foreword by Tom King. In there, he doesn't mention anything about crypto, so still waiting on that one. You're going to be ringing him tonight, aren't you? Say this dude in the UK is going to kick your ass if the dog dies.
I'll tell him. Yeah. I talk to
Cool.
him regularly. So.
Excellent. In the blurb, it mentions how someone mutters Alan Moore. Now, I've read Chronphage, and I can see that there's some Alan Moore-esque elements in there. Is this like a definitive vibe that you were going for, or is Alan Moore kind of where you sort of get your horror vibe from?
That's a good question. I mean, I to some degree, some of the earliest, for me, horror comics I read were Alan Moore's Swamp Thing, and they were sophisticated suspense. I remember that was a big selling. Remember, like the pre-Vertigo selling point when they have like Jamie Delano and Hellblazer and this idea of sophisticated suspense, or basically just horror with some thinky in it. And that's always been, I think, again, we're talking about the contrast between hack slash, which is knives and boobies, and this stuff. But so yeah, I'm sure that was a big inspiration for sure. I didn't think of it directly, although I do think I might have been really inspired by when he did 1963. There was do you remember that comic? It's a superhero.
It's an Image parody book from the kind of parody.
Like it's a very interesting. They're trying to do like comics from the 60s, and I recall there was a villain in there who was like, I think he called the 5D man or something like that, and you could only see him in slices, like because he was time. And I remember that blew my mind because I always liked science, I always liked physics and stuff, and I just remember that the way that they portrayed that, on 2D and paper, is having him like, they were trying to fight him and they would just get like a cross section. I'm sure that inspired part of this, because as you see the monster in this book, and we mess around with, the time is a dimension, etc. I'm sure that was a partial inspiration for sure.
So I was thinking more kind of like the tendrily bits that kind of go on in that, because I was looking through that and I was like, you know what, that reminds me of Abby tripping in Swamp Thing.
The Beset in what's his name? Beach. Absolutely. I'm sure that was a huge, in part then that is influenced. That was inspired by, sort of old EC horror comics, and so I'm sure all that, and Ray Bradbury and all that. So I'm sure a big part of that was put in my head by reading those, and then then discovering the source material. So
the cast. I want to talk a little bit about the cast. The cast's quite diverse. Was this a creative choice, or was it kind of, because I keep reading in comics about how there's forced diversity and how there's this and there's that, and I'm again very much of a make the character interesting and I'll read it kind of person. Right? So was the diversity because Chloe's it's not alluded to, but African American. You've got Heath, who is Alt Earth American, maybe you could say.
Yeah, he appears sort of. Yeah, you're Eastern European, I guess.
Yeah. So was that kind of was that by choice or?
Yeah. Well, a big part of it is that it's set in my neighborhood.
Okay, cool.
So, it's a really diverse neighborhood, and
good job.
So I think in part it would be hard to do it honestly if people didn't appear, in different races and stuff and different nationalities.
Cool.
My area here where I live in Chicago, not my neighborhood specifically, but one over, is like one of the most diverse neighborhoods in the world. It has like one of the most languages spoken in any place. So it's just what I see, I guess. And I just, a big part of it for me, if I'm gonna do a story in Chicago, is that it just has to look like Chicago. So
cool. It works for me. It's just the diversity thing. It's always, every time I turn Twitter on, there's somebody talking about it. And I'm like, to me, I look at Chloe, I see it as Chloe, and that's it. It doesn't.
I mean, it's a concentrated choice, and in part, her relationship with her mother was inspired by people I've known, and in part, she sort of lives this second-generation immigrant life. So I thought that was, also a big part of my neighborhood. So also, something that my kid will go through because her mother is an immigrant, and so just things I think about, and just trying to make things feel real. And I kind of, I steal from life. So, there are parts of the conversation that Chloe has with her mother that I borrowed from my wife talking to her mother, and, and other people I've known, so it's all kind of just, if it ends up diverse, it's just because that's the way my world works. And I assume probably a lot of people's.
No, I agree. I agree. I thought it was, as I say, I don't, if I wasn't writing for an interview, I wouldn't have asked the question. I was just saying, it's Chloe and Hughes and so on. I've got to say, before we move on to a different topic, I thought there was an element in the book that was very brave to write. And I'm a parent myself. And I remember when my son was born and stood there with my baby boy, and I'm thinking, holy crap, my world has just changed. Yeah. And then thinking to myself, can I put it back?
Oh yeah.
And the fear that you feel at that point. And when I read the character go through something similar, I felt a little bit like, you know what? It's not just me. I'm not a bad person for thinking that. Yeah. That was such a well-observed, brave thing to write. How I suppose I want to applaud, because I mean, it's such an honest emotion. Were you worried that you'd get some sort of backlash for that? Because parents are supposed to be parents and love the kids no matter what, and we do. But
no, I mean, because I guess to me, a horror story, it has to be honest and raw. And I guess part of the horror is that you feel those things, right? That's That's kind of part of the horror. I mean,
it's the thing that keeps you awake at the quiet corners of the night, thinking, "Oh my god, I can't believe I thought about this." Yeah.
That's it, exactly. And every time you have to write a horror story, you try to think of the things that actually scare you, so you can put those things right back in there. And obviously, before I had a kid, I didn't know that that fear, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, I could, things sort of academically, they must exist, but you don't feel them, you don't understand them. So, that's kind of one of the nice things about getting older, is you experience more things and you kind of have a range. I mean, obviously, hack slash is a slasher thing, and I understood when I was in my 20s fear of sex. Like, I got that because you're afraid of getting someone pregnant, you're afraid of STDs. That's all the things that slasher movies are about, right? So right. I got those things, and as you get older, you have different fears, right? I'm not afraid of those same things anymore. I'm afraid of, those terrifying thoughts you have, right, in the quiet hours of just, how am I going to do this? Should I have made this choice? The more human I think I can make those things, then I'm more successful with a story.
I will say I've spoken to Mark Waid about his book about science fiction history. Mark seems to be a bit of a traditionalist. How did you manage? Because Mark Waid's the publisher of Humanoid. How did you manage to get something so idiosyncratic that's a little bit sexy, a little bit horror, a little bit emotive? How did you manage to get past a traditionalist?
Well, that's the interesting thing about Mark, is that I think he loves comics, right? And he understands. Right. And putting him in charge of Humanoids is a great idea, because he brings this, really lots of depth of history to comics. Mm-hmm. He obviously is. I mean, everybody knows he knows superhero comics inside out, and he knows Golden Age, Silver Age stuff. But he also just understands story better than, certainly better than anybody I've ever worked with. So, if it's honest, it plays. I think I got some of this stuff from Mark advice from years before. Like, I remember him saying something to the effect of, as early as possible, you have to tell us what the character wants, so that we as the reader, can see what gets in their way. And he said, start the story as late as possible. And these are all things I've just already had in my head is Mark Waid stuff I give advice to students. So, you know, I don't feel like I had to get anything by him. I just had to make sure I was writing something that I wouldn't break his basic rules, right? Like, you know, and they're technical rules, not moral or not like, you know, he says it's not old school. It's not about, you know, making sure the JSA, whatever, that kind of stuff, you know. It's just, he's so good at that stuff, like supernaturally so, that I always had that in my head.
Cool. I think, you know, that's a interesting point. I mean, Mark Waid is one of the creative gurus of his era, so definitely.
Yeah.
So, Tim, whilst we've got you here, yeah, you've got a wave of fans. They would kick my butt like I'm going to kick Tom King's if Crypto dies. Not that I'm ever going to say I'm going to come across. Anyway, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about some of your other superhero stuff. Is that all right?
Yeah, of course.
You are currently writing Nightwing, correct?
Well, I'm doing Robin, so he's in there. Yes, I'm writing Robins, but Nightwing is in the story again. So yeah, I'm always dealing with Dick. He's everywhere.
And you also did Grayson.
Yes.
So, how worried were you when the whole Grayson thing started and he was devoid of his Nightwing identity and had to go as the agent for Spiral?
Oh man, I mean, it's a weird thing to try to explain because, so like I told you, I love Robin, right? I love the idea of Robin. I always loved Dick Grayson as that character. I always loved Teen Titans Nightwing and Dick Grayson. I never liked Nightwing. I didn't like. Let me explain. I never liked like Bloodhaven, cop. Like.
All right. Okay.
And then his bad guy was Blockbuster, because it was Daredevil, right? It was just they were trying to. I mean, it was literally just Daredevil. Like he had.
This is the Chuck Dixon, Scott McDaniel era, right?
I mean, it goes beyond those guys, but yes, absolutely. A big chunk of their run was that stuff. And I like the characterization stuff, but I just don't care about that scenario. It's not interesting to me. I never really cared about it. But I always loved Dick Grayson, and when I was working on Batman Eternal and the Dick's when Nightwing would show up, I think it was evident that I really liked that character, even if I don't care about the sort of the template of Daredevil, which is much better served for a lawyer than a guy who's a sidekick, right? It doesn't make sense. So, but in any case, then they were relaunching his book, or trying to figure out a sort of new story for him, and they had something, and it wasn't really working, and so they just asked me, like, I remember actually it's literally like whatever 6 years ago today or 7 years ago today, because it was Valentine's Day, I remember, and Katie Kubert said, well, what would you do with him if he was a spy? And because they were just kind of throwing stuff out, they didn't know what was gonna, and I was like, first I was like, you're insane, people are gonna hate that, and then like by the end of that weekend, it was like Valentine's Day weekend, I thought, this is way better idea, and it fits the character way better, and so I pitched it. And at the same time, they had asked Tom to pitch one because he was a real spy, and they had told us both that we got the job, because there was like some communication thing, and then they just said, hey, can you work together? We like both your pitches. What if you stuck them together? Which is a weird way to go, but it worked fine because Tom was a big idea guy, and he was a format guy and all this sort of stuff. But he was a little green, and he was probably a little bit nervous. And the first issue of Nightwing that he did with me was Nightwing 30. It kind of came across more brutal than he meant it to be. And I think at the time it was sort of people like, oh boy. But I just remember how much people hated us. Like when they announced that book and they did Nightwing 30, people hated us. We would go to conventions and people, they were just like, oh, you're ruining Nightwing. You're ruining that Dick Grayson. And then the book came out and people were like, oh, I see. And one of the things then when Tom and I would do signings together, we used to like keep track of how many times we heard it, because people would say, I wanted to hate Grayson, but I didn't.
When you say Tom, that's Tom King.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. I will say this, that I absolutely love Grayson.
It's a good book.
It is a good book.
It's also very in character, right? We didn't ruin it. Like we didn't do anything, he doesn't the conflict is that he comes from a black and white world, and now he's in one that's great, and that's interesting. And I thought the setup had so much possibility, and I think we really rang a lot of good moments out of it.
I think Nightwing's one of those characters where, hate me or not, I'm just a fan from the cheap seats. Sometimes DC don't know what to do with, because they can't promote him to Batman. Because I know they've done it twice. But they're not going to do it full time.
Right, can't do it full time. Yeah,
and because there's always going to be someone shouting for Bruce Wayne, normally me. And you've got another Batman as well, so you can't have 3 Batman kicking around right now, or Batmen. You can't make him Robin because there's more Robins than there are Batmen. So you're kind of stuck in this prism of a world where you can only go so far. So for me, Grayson it broke him out of that mold a little bit. Were people annoyed that it probably wasn't the Nightwing Dick Grayson? Yeah. Did they give it a chance to find its feet? Yeah. I thought it was great. Yeah. I liked the Helena Bertinelli that was in that book. She made much more sense. I still don't understand why Helena Bertinelli is classed as Bat Family now. I have no idea how that happened, because but obviously you do, because you're in the know. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. Right. So we talked about one mainstream book. We've got to talk about another. I have a friend who is possibly going to Terrific Con this year to call out Jerry Conway for being a murderer, for killing Gwen Stacy. My friends are bonkers. He cares about Gwen. I think about crypto. What's that say? So, but you're bringing back not just Gwen. You're bringing back Gwen. Yeah. The Gwenverse. What? How did this start?
It's one of those, going back, Jerry Conway did not murder her.
I know. That's his words, not my words.
She's fictional. You can't murder her. But on the other side of this,
don't tell that to my friend, for Christ's sake.
You can't do it. You can't do anything. It has to have stakes. But in any case, the idea was from Marvel, and I'd done a short for or like a one shot for them with for the what do you call it? Heroes Reborn, the event. So it was
this is the kind of Batgirl Gwen book, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Great book. I love that book. At the time I read that, I was like, man, I wish Batgirl was like this.
Yeah, well, Vita did that one, and I did the Nighthawk one, but it features Gwen and all that stuff. But when I wrote it, it's like clear I had tons of love for Spider-Man, which I do.
Mm-hmm.
That was the first comic book I ever read, first superhero I ever knew. So when they were kicking around this Gwenverse thing, they had designs from Peach Momoko, and they said, do you have any affection for Ghost Spider? And I was like, my daughter is obsessed with a Spider-Man. She's 2.5 years old. She watches that Spidey and His Amazing Friends. She sings that song constantly. She's always running around saying, Gwen, Miles, it's like, I have to do the job. But I also really liked Jason and Robbie's book. And those guys are old friend of mine. And so, getting a chance to work on there, I understood with the tone of it. I understood what they were going for. I know it was sort of, Blondie as a superhero. I knew all those things. And so, I pitched for it. But the one thing I said was it cannot be a multiverse story, because there's a lot of those.
God, man, it's like you can't turn a comic. You can't go in a comic book shop with a being another multiverse. Everybody's doing it.
I know.
Dynamite, DC, Marvel. Oh,
exactly. And they're fun as hell. Hell, I did one. I did He-Man and Masters of the Multiverse. I did it. I can't say shit. But but I knew it couldn't be that, because the stakes are too low. Cool. You get a lot of great designs, and you get to play with the what if idea of it. But the stakes are low, because it's just, it's some other dimension. It doesn't matter. So the version of the story I pitched is it's not a multiverse story at all. It's one thing that they find out. They're like, well, I thought this was multiverse. Like, no, this is your home. This is what happened to your world. So we really messed with 65 a bunch, and we introduced this new villain. But basically, it allows us to do, and I used a lot of what I learned doing Chronphage about time travel, and physics and everything else. Of course, it's superhero, so it's a lot crazier and not held by standard. But so I think it works really well, and it's it's high stakes and really gets to play with the character of Gwen Stacy. also does some things that I think really work. When they first did, those Spider-Verse stories, they figured that thing out, and they really it's the most concentrated into the Spider-Verse film, which is, Spider-Man is the greatest, second greatest or first greatest superhero ever created, right? It's Superman and Spider-Man, two best ideas of all time, as far as superheroes go. And that thing that people really respond to about Spider-Man is, this could be us, if right? It's just it's someone with power, responsibility, and everybody gets it. So, playing with that, but we're playing at the other side to some degree, which I'll let people figure that one out. But and then we just do tons of crazy stuff. There's a whole bunch of weird villains from alternate dimensions, and
Cool.
really fun. And
I must admit, I'm kind of looking forward to it. I have some Ghost Spider in my collection. It's interesting when you talk about Peter Parker. I always think Peter Parker's interesting when he's Peter Parker. It's when he puts on the Spider-Man mask, fair enough, he's going to win, he's going to web people up and all sorts of stuff. But it's Peter Parker as Peter Parker that makes the book interesting.
Oh, for sure. I mean, the loser, right? He's the loser.
Yeah.
He keeps fighting for you, even though it's not going to help him at all. That's great. That's an American iconic idea, or it was before the last several years. But
before the dark times, before the Empire.
Right, exactly.
Star Wars. All right. So what's last couple of questions then. So what are you reading right now? What's tickling your comic book tickle buds?
I mean, I haven't read any comics in a while. Yeah, it's really hard. Just because I have to grade all these comics I get for school, and I got to read all these scripts for reference, and so I don't really.
Okay.
But I've been reading a lot of interesting books.
Okay, good.
So yeah, a lot of stuff for research. I was reading a book about like some physics stuff, which I thought was really interesting, and one about like what. This is my favorite one. Something I think is really interesting. Is like the origins of some of this stuff in Christianity, like angels and demons and shit. But where it actually comes from, and like how much it's been exploited and changed to be like, sellable as a Hallmark card or whatever.
Yeah.
Like the original version of demons is so much different, and I think that one's pretty interesting. So yeah, nowadays I have to read like nonfiction. And
I guess I can feel your pain a little bit on this, because I write reviews for Comic Crusaders, as well as do this pod and Old Timers. I'm on Old Timers. I'm on Definitive Crusade. There comes a point where I look at my pile of comics to look at, to read for fun. I'm like, more comics?
Yeah, it's hard, man. And it in part is whenever I start a new project, I got to read like 10 comics, at least, if not, for Robbins, I read like 40 or 50, and at least, going back and trying to get all the history stuff. So, then when I sit down with like, oh, what are my friends doing? It's like, oh, everyone's.
I talk to them. I don't need to read the stuff. I talk to them.
Well, I wouldn't read it. You know what I did? I read for Christmas. I got Tom's Rorschach, and I got his Mystery in Space, or his Adam Strange Adventures.
Right.
I loved Rorschach. I loved parts of Strange Adventures. I didn't like it as much as I liked Rorschach or his Mr. Miracle, but it was beautifully illustrated. So there you go. There's a little capsule reviews.
Cool. There you go. For me, I'm absolutely in love with his Supergirl book.
I read 2 issues of that. I thought it was beautifully done as well. Yeah, it's clear. I can't wait for Batman Catwoman to end. I haven't read it. It's beautifully drawn. I want to get the Liam Sharp issues for sure.
The Liam Sharp issues are so contrastually different than the Clay Man. Clay Man's all nice, clean lines, and Liam Sharp's off on some sort of Arkham Asylum, Strange House in a Strange World kind of vibe. It's honestly, it's jarring how different it is. Not jarring good or jarring bad. It's just jarring. All right.
I love Liam's stuff. I knew he was kind of going with a kind of McKeany weird montage style. So I'll check that out. It sounds awesome.
Yeah. That's pretty good. From Image, I'm liking Stray Dogs.
Oh yes, I did read Stray Dogs a lot. That was great.
Yeah.
That's my friend Tony. That's a fantastic book. Also got that for Christmas. That was a good one.
Yeah, so there you go. Stray Dogs found a good home. Boom.
It is a goodie. It's very well.
Don't forget Chippy Waiters. All right, guys, there you go. Tim, thank you so much for hanging out with us. Really appreciate it. Good luck with Chronphage. I've read it. It's out on the day this pod's going to drop, which is Wednesday, the 16th of February from Humanoids. Go and check it out at your local comic book shop. Is it available digitally, Tim? It will be on Comixology probably. Or check out the Humanoids website. I'll do your PR, don't you worry.
Yes, I'm sure it
is. All right. Don't forget to check out the UCPN for all your favorite shows, including the Definitive Crusade, all about DC Comics, the No Prize podcast, where you get to hear stuff about the Marvel Universe, the MCU, and Disney Plus. And of course, you saw the advert earlier. If you're interested in Adams Aparo and all the people we've been talking about in the pod, go check out the Old Timers Comic Book Show. There you go. Right. Tim?
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you very much. Totally had a blast. And next time, this is Johnny the Machine Hughes saying adios.
Visit undercovercapes.com for the latest and greatest podcasts via the Undercover Capes Podcast Network. Also visit our parent company website, comiccrusaders.shop, all about comic pop culture.